Okay, without further ado, I'm going to call in. We've got a panel of 3 speakers at the moment. They're each going to speak for 8 minutes, and then we'll open up to the floor. After that, and so really, especially if you're at the back, can you make sure you put your hand up really high, because I'm actually quite short-sighted and very in denial about it. Because I don't want to be accused of not calling people, okay? I'll open up to the floor, allow people contributions, and then the people on the panel will sum up in the reverse order that they spoke in originally. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to ask Eileen, who's come here from Defend Council Housing, to speak.
Thanks. So the meeting is about what we're going to do about the housing crisis, because I don't think that we need to discuss anymore whether there's a housing crisis. Although I will say there are still people who want to say, oh, it's a London issue, or it's a young people's issue. I think actually neither of those things are true. There are specific areas where the thing is most intense, but people in Britain are paying more for housing now than at any time since that figure's been measured. And that tells us that in the class war between the people and landlords and big money, we're losing. They're winning. They're rolling it back in their direction. This week, I went to a screening of Cathy Come Home, which is because it's a kind of anniversary. And what is really distressing about watching that film, which I saw way back in the day, is that there was significant progress made in the intervening years in terms of the rights of homeless families, in terms of claims on councils for rehousing and so on. And most of that is being rolled back significantly. So we are going back at a rate of knots to the worst of the 50s and 60s. And I'll leave other people to talk about the terrible parallels. In the 50s, one of the drivers, really, of the 60s and 70s housing reforms was tackling the what's become known as the Lachman Landlords, named after Peter Lachman, who was a particularly obnoxious private landlord who exploited the lowest paid and the most precariously housed people, numbers of them in Notting Hill, and burnt people out quite often when he wanted to get rid of them and flip or, increase the rents. And some of the council housing in Kensington and Chelsea was built on the back of the campaigns to get rid of the terrible Lachman landlords. Is the wheel going backwards at a rate of knots is the question that we have to put to ourselves. But I do think to begin this meeting, to get it straight, in both a bad way and a good way, Grenfell changes everything. For housing, Grenfell is like a great obscene marker in the ground of where we have got to, the terrible rolling back of our rights and of our guarantees, the price of austerity, the price of David Cameron's bonfire of regulations. The bonfire of regulations is Grenfell Tower. And I think for most of us, certainly for anybody I know who's been involved in housing campaigns, this has been a period of real sorrow and fear and rage. And I think all of us have been going round that circle, and obviously for some people it's been more intense. But I just want to remind you, somebody from Grenfell, the Grenfell Action Group, who may make it to join us, said on the radio yesterday, the thing is, everything now is about money. And he was referring to dignity, safety, security in your home, the fire service, how long it takes people to turn up with a high enough ladder. Everything is about money. And that really, the price of austerity is measured in the lives of working class people living in a tower block. And I think the rest of us know that there are lots more blocks that could be. And while the Grenfell tragedy has exposed the really terrible practices in Kensington and Chelsea, and the things that landlords get away with if they are not held to account and their feet aren't forced to the fire really by active tenant organisation. I just want to say for a moment, let nobody think that this means the crisis is about council housing or council and housing association housing, because the very worst conditions and the least regulation is in the private rented sector. And if you think some tower blocks have got dodgy cladding, if you are a private renter, you really need to get with demanding to know in detail what are the specifications of all the fire safety concerning where you live. And if you're a hospital worker, and if you teach in a school, and if you work in a large office block. In fact, all of us need to stop leaving it to the landlord or the employer. These people cannot be trusted. And I just want to say, what Grenfell is a reminder, should bring us all up stark to realise, is that fire safety certificates are now issued by the owners of the building. The landlord is responsible for the fire safety certificate. Back in the day, the fire service used to come in and do it. Let Camden be a reminder to all of us. The landlord, Camden, working with a PFI scheme on the Chalcott's estate, had signed off those buildings, and as soon as the fire service went in, they said they need emptying. What does that tell you? Building control is also now, developers can now pick their own approved building control inspector who can sign off a building. They don't have to have an independent verification. Health and safety is now, the ashes are in David Cameron's bonfire. These are the things you need to think about when you're trying to rest easy at night. But what I want to say really is that at this meeting, this is not just about fire safety, although we need to organise about fire safety. And there's an important London-wide meeting on Wednesday, and it would be good if everybody made sure that we organise to make sure everybody you know who's bothered is at that meeting or hears about it. But we also need to organise. Now, we've spent a year and a half working to fight the Housing and Planning Act, and in that process trying to build a movement that brings together housing association, private renters, council tenants, if you like, the existing organisations and the new potential ones, and the trade unions. If you like, we've had some success, and it's the bones of the beginnings of what we need to do, involving the co-ops and the travellers groups and so on. So we need to organise, but the reason I'm standing here really is because to organise effectively, you also have to work out some political things. You have to work out how to combine the local with the big theory and the big understanding. How do we actually organise? Who has to lead this fight? Who are our allies and who are our enemies? And how do we relate to organisations like councils and so on? And how do we build from below while holding politicians to account? Now, I'm not going to try and answer all those questions. I think in this room, in this discussion, we can work out how we approach those. And I would say we need everybody who's in this room to go out of it with your name on a sign-up sheet and a sense that you are part of this movement that we need to build.
Our next speaker is Moyra Samuels, who's the chair of the Justice for Grenfell campaign.
Hi, everybody. I thought I'd just introduce myself a little bit. I live 300 meters from the Grenfell Tower. I'm not a survivor of Grenfell, but I know people within the tower. And I was there on the morning that the tower burned and stood in front of it. I'm also what is colloquially known as a local activist. So I have been involved in lots of the campaigns in the area. And so I thought what I'd talk about is just give you a feel for what Kensington and Chelsea is like as a borough. I'll start with a quote from our recently elected Labour MP. Kensington and Chelsea is a microcosm of everything that is wrong with the country after 7 years of Tory government. 3 years ago, I proved that the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea is the most unequal borough in Britain. This has actually got worse in our deprived areas, with worsening life expectancy, poorer health, and the return to Victorian illnesses like TB and even rickets. Opportunities for training and work are being squeezed out, often by the council itself, privatising our publicly owned assets, with the sad but inevitable consequence of rising youth violence and crime. That's Emmerdale Code. So that describes, I think, Kensington and Chelsea, I think, in a nutshell. However, I thought I'd also talk about some of the campaigns we have been involved in within the area and why the council, Kensington and Chelsea Council, is so hated. It started off quite a long while, but more recently we've been fighting against the closure of an outstanding nursery, Maxilla. The reason for closure is that suddenly they were worried about pollution. The nursery has been there for almost 30 years. They had no interest in the pollution and the impact of pollution on all the children before this. They've underfunded and eventually closed a local stable. Now, for working class children, the opportunities to ride a horse is probably rare. And we've had this incredible stable where it cost £1 for children to have a ride on it. It was also used by lots of the disability groups in the area for people with disabilities to come and actually ride a horse. That was run down, and we fought and fought and fought, and we lost that campaign. A local community venue where there was lots of music, lots of Caribbean, lots of African music, local musicians, where actually the community got together for funerals, weddings. We need those kind of spaces in our areas because they're quite rare. That was actually, they gave them a 3-month lease and they couldn't operate. And they handed it over to some organization called West Bank Gallery. Another fight that we relentlessly fought and lost. And our library. Now, this is one that actually, since Grenfell, we are determined not to lose. The Tory council, led by the hideous Rockmelon, who has subsequently resigned, leased our local library without consultation to the private prep school, Notting Hill Prep, for £9,000 a year. We are fighting to actually stop that, but already the contracts have gone through. The local college is under threat of closure, that they are going to actually, they have to sell it off to build more unaffordable houses. And Silchester, opposite Grenfell, there are 3 huge towers. I don't know if anybody, if you've been into the area, you've seen it. The Silchester Towers campaign has been one of the biggest fights we've had regarding housing in the area. The council has favoured a regeneration programme that has suggested that they want to demolish all 3 towers. That's 1,500 residents who will be made homeless and will be moved out of the area. Now, this is what we call the nuclear option. There were lots of other options suggested, and we got involved and we campaigned around that. But the borough's favoured option is the nuclear option of demolishing it and building low-rise blocks and taking away an absolutely beautiful park in the middle of this block. Lots of people in Silchester have lived there for generations. And I think the idea of being moved and shifted and losing your base and your community is absolutely and utterly foul. And then we come to Grenfell. So with all of these campaigns going on, all of us fighting on all these campaigns, we have Grenfell and what has happened at Grenfell. And I think people should look at the Grenfell Action blog if you haven't already. I have a quote here from something that was on the blog in 2016. It is a truly terrifying thought, but the Grenfell Action Group firmly believe that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord, the Kensington Chelsea Tenants Management Organisation, and bring an end to the dangerous living conditions and neglect of health and safety legislation that they inflict upon their tenants and leaseholders. And the title of this article was called Playing with Fire. So they have been very, very much aware. They've been the Tenants Management Organisation, the local authority, have been told again and again. Grenfell Action Group have been silenced or tried to be silenced with solicitors' letters and accusations thrown at actually the people who have written the articles. The community in Grenfell now, aside from facing a huge trauma, we're now having, through the Justice for Grenfell campaign, to actually think about the inquiry. We have 7 days in which to get the remit has to be in. So we constantly put under pressure. And we have to, as a community, think about not just the cladding, not just the lack of sprinklers, and no batteries in the alarms, and one fire exit, all the things that I think people have read about that exist within Grenfell. But what we want the remit to include is what has happened before the fire and what has happened subsequently to the fire. Where communities, 3 days ago, I found a survivor trying to find somewhere to get vouchers for food. This is the level of incompetence that is going on within Kensington and Chelsea. Grenfell, I think, has led to a huge rise of fear within communities right across Britain. I think communities, tenants in council blocks are now worried about their safety, and I think they should be. I think there may well be a Grenfell in lots of communities across the country, and therefore I think what Eileen is saying about actually us getting organised and actually fighting to have our voices heard, both within management organisations and councils, is really, really significant. Some councils, like Camden, have obviously responded quite quickly, but I think the other councils are still continuing in very much the same vein. I think that we need to join with all of our campaigns. I think that what's happening in Grenfell, as Eileen has said, has opened up a mirror, has revealed a mirror of actually a neoliberal system that is in crisis. I'm sorry, if you can't actually, after 3 weeks after the fire, provide food for a survivor, what hope is there, or what confidence should we have that you actually have any care for the working class community? And therefore, I think that actually we need to think about joining some of our campaigns. All of our communities are facing cuts in schools. We're facing hospital cuts. We're facing also cuts in public sector workers. And I really believe that aside from the incompetence and arrogance of Kensington and Chelsea, that actually the reason they couldn't respond as they should have is because they cut all their work, their public service workers, to the bone. And therefore, that's something that actually we need to get together through the unions and start really fighting. Okay. This Grenfell is an attack on the working class. And I think that actually we really do need to get together so that we don't burn in our beds, people, because they cut costs or because they focused on profits. So join us, support Justice for Grenfell, and go out into your communities and fight for your rights. Thank you.
Thanks, Moyra. The final speaker on the panel today is Tanya Murat, and she comes from Southwark Defence Council Housing.
Thank you. Okay, Southwark Defence Council Housing was created in 1998. People may know that back then and still now, to an extent, councils are attempting to transfer all their stock, privatise their stock. That's what they tried to do in 1998, and we were formed to stop them, and we did stop them. There's still now 38,000 council homes in Southwark, and if we hadn't have existed, there wouldn't be. Ever since then, we have been fighting on a number of fronts. We've been fighting against demolitions, social cleansing, privatisation. We've organised or helped to organise 3 of the 4 demos on housing in our borough in the last 3 years. So there's a lot of anger around. People have talked about this, in other meetings. In Southwark, we weren't surprised at what happened in the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell Tower disaster, because what happened was, because of that avoidable blaze, residents and people in the local area clearly moved from being shocked to grief, to anger, to rage, came out onto the streets and expressed that anger to demand justice. We weren't surprised by that. We've been seeing that happen, growing over the last few years. We've had to face cuts, privatisation, deregulation, the worship of the market, utter contempt for working class people. And it's that contempt which kills working class people. It killed them at Grenfell. It's killing us every day. Frederick Engels described what happens to working class people as social murder, not like individual murder where someone, attacks you with a knife. Social murder, where the things that go on a day-to-day basis, business as usual in capitalist society, end up with working class people dying and dying young. And that's clearly what happened then. But we could see for some time, as I was saying, that things have been changing in the public consciousness, and certainly amongst working class council tenants. So even though, and I'm sure Paul Burnham, I hope he will come and say a few words about what went on in Haringey. Even though Haringey Council voted last week to privatise their entire council stock, there was a big demo against them. Right? There was a huge demo. It was a very angry demo. Even though Housing Association One Housing, and there's truths here from One Housing, tried to implement a 40% rent increase, they were beaten by the solidarity of that rent strike. the Southwark Council leader complains that people, if only we'd stop misrepresenting the social cleansing that's going on in the borough as such, then people would support his plans. And a week before the general election, it was a straw in the wind. We had a hustings in Southwark. It was a housing hustings, mainly attended by tenants and leaseholders in the borough. Harriet Harman, who's our MP with probably a much increased majority, a huge majority, the majority of the people in the room would have been voting for Harriet Harman. The amount of heckling she had to endure that night was pure theatre. At one point, the chair said to the audience, "Look, please stop heckling. It's doing you no good." And someone in the audience said, "How do you establish that? How do you establish we're doing no good?" Well, actually, that's kind of the mood of the thing at the moment. How do you know that what you're being told is really the reality? And in fact, people in authority aren't listening to what we're saying, and in a lot of cases, they're telling lies. So, the fight against the housing bill that was mentioned by Eileen earlier, which is now the Housing Act, demonstrated, I think, the growing influence of the housing movement. By pulling in Labour councillors, the same ones who are pushing through the social cleansing agenda, by pulling those into the movement as far as possible, but keeping the pressure up on them at the same time, by using the potential power of the official tenants movement and the trade unions, we have managed to battle the Housing Act to a standstill. So whilst elements of the Act could be implemented if the Tories were in any fit state to do so, the campaign has effectively shredded the Tories' main weapon for destroying social and council housing. The pay-to-stay element has been dropped. The sell-off of council homes on the open market has been diverted into a 2-year pilot scheme, and lots of other elements have also been shelved. However, the deregulation of housing associations and the attacks on gypsies and travellers remain. The Housing Act is still a key target in the overall fight for decent housing for all, but we need to demand that the next Labour government commits to repealing the Housing Act, and in the meantime, councils commit to defying the Housing Act. They should not be doing the Tories' dirty work for them. And really, there is absolutely no need for them to do so. The argument was, we can't defy the Tories, and this is about cuts as well. We have to make the cuts. We can't defy the Tories. Why not? Well, we can't defy the Tories because the Tories, in their all-powerful magnificence, will come in to the council, put the administrators on and force through the cuts, and it'll be a lot worse. You'll get them instead of us. Well, actually, do you think the Tories are in any fit state to do that right now? I very much doubt it. If now is not the time to call on councils to defy Tory cuts, what is the time? Okay, I just want to talk about demolitions and social cleansing, because that struggle continues. And we have to be clear about this question of Grenfell Tower and tower blocks, because straight after Grenfell, we had a couple of interventions from some Labour politicians who really should know better. David Lammy, Tottenham MP, against the Haringey HDV at the same time. He writes in a newspaper that he thinks that tower blocks should be torn down. Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, does the same. We need to ensure that they do not use this avoidable tragedy to further their social cleansing agenda. we have a group in London called Demolition Watch. It's been up and down, but it's still going. And my goodness, we punch above our weight. Demolition Watch says, we say where demolition is proposed, there needs to be a ballot, and where a majority of tenants and residents vote against, demolition should not go ahead. We offer support and learn from each other. Until the national policy is changed, there will need to be a fight, estate by estate. In the current political situation, any campaign uniting tenants and leaseholders, anti-cuts groups and trade unions will be able to tap into wide support, and this is where things are changing. We will be able to get that wider support if we fight, estate by estate. We can beat the social cleansers. I've told I've got a minute, so I'm gonna end on this. We're sponsoring a meeting on the 12th of July, Defend Council Housing, please come. We want answers in the wake of the Grenfell massacre. We want the government and not tenants to pay for the necessary fire safety measures. That's important. The government pays. They created this. They need to get us out of it. Heard that somewhere before. There's an estate in Southwark, people might have picked this up, called the Ledbury Estate. They have been complaining for years about holes in their walls, holes that would compromise the stay put policy, because some people can smell smoke coming from the kitchen in somebody else's flat. Clearly an issue. They lost patience with the council just last week, and they posted up these pictures online, and they got in contact with the fire service, and the fire service came down and said, I'm sorry, but this place is a fire trap. The council now has to put 24-hour patrols on 4 tower blocks in Southwark. 2 weeks before that, the council had said all the fire risk assessments are up to date. The fire service have signed these off. Everything's fine. Clearly, they're not fine. But what we need to now do is ensure that the councils keep listening, ensure that the landlords start listening, and say that we, the tenants, the residents, should be the recognised, legitimate guardians of our homes and communities, where our voices are heard and where decisions are made about us, by us. The Grenfell survivors and their supporters showed before, during and after the fire that we have to fight to gain control of what happens in our communities. Only our own organisation and our own collective strength can transform this world into one where ordinary people's lives matter. And Joe Delaney from Grenfell Action Group said at the opening rally, no one else is going to do this for us. So we have to do it ourselves. This is about democracy. This is about working class people taking action. This is about forcing local authorities and landlords to listen by our own collective action. Solidarity is what is going to win this.
Hello everybody, I'm Paul Burnham from Haringey Defend Council Housing, and just following on from that, it's the proposed demolition of council housing on a large scale in London that's been the main threat, really, since David Cameron made a speech at the beginning of 2016 in which he said we're going to knock down all these estates, nothing can stand in our way of demolishing them. And in Haringey in particular, we've got this proposal to set up a joint venture company with the Australian development company called Lendlease, and this is going to get £2 billion worth of work. And what's it going to do? It's going to demolish really affordable, really secure council housing and build private housing in its place. And it's going to bring in galloping house prices, or what they call leapfrogging house prices, which is simply going to price out working class, poor and black people from the area. Now, it's really important that we don't call this regeneration. I'm not going to be prepared to call this regeneration. We have to take control of the language, just as the American students did when they're fighting against the Vietnam War. So we've got to name the system. We have to name the process that's being done to us. If we have an argument about what we think about regeneration with some critics who think there's some problem with regeneration, we're going to lose. So let's call it what it is. This is social cleansing hiding in plain sight. And we also, there's an issue, of course, that this is being carried out by a Labour council. Haringey's always been a Labour council. So you've got a contradiction that Jeremy Corbyn has led the Labour Party to fantastic progress in the election on the 8th of June, and yet you have people who are in the Labour Party but carry out these awful policies. And in response, it's not just been one demonstration, it's been a series of demonstrations, a series of lobbies. You've got a really serious... But what's different about Haringey, and why Haringey is such an important test case, is that it's open argument inside the Labour Party as well. More open than anywhere else. There are 17 Labour councillors in the Labour group who vote against the HDV. There are 2 cabinet members who abstain and refuse to go to cabinet meetings rather than support the HDV policy. The Labour critics and the Liberal Democrats work together without any sniping or point scoring whatsoever. The people outside in the community, including revolutionaries, work with these people inside the council on a completely focused way, because we realised the threat that we're up against. So, you know, and we did deputation at a council meeting with a crowd outside the front of the building trying to get in, and another group of people out at the back of the building trying to get in. And the Civic Centre building itself, of course, is one of the first ones set to be demolished and to be replaced by exclusively unaffordable housing. Yes, I will sum up just by saying that, therefore, what can we do about this? It's got to be, there's going to be legal challenge to what's taken place, but above all, it's got to be a tenant, public and political pressure. And this is a time when the MPs who've spoken out against this need to work properly to get this council not to do what it's threatening to do. And when Jeremy Corbyn, in particular, who's been approached about this, but he's been silent, now he has fantastic mandate to carry out the policies he's always believed in since the 8th of June. He has to speak out as well, and we have to lean on these rogue councillors and get this policy stopped.
This has been a very emotional meeting so far, so I really want to lower the tone of the meeting by reading from my council's strategy document. You can look online later on. Anyway, very quickly. The council wants to encourage a more economically balanced community and will therefore seek a greater social mix in the borough. This is Waltham Forest. Fairly well mixed already, but it's not quite what they mean. Waltham Forest has experienced the trend of more people on higher and median incomes moving out of the borough than moving in. This is largely due to the fact that they're unable to find suitable housing options to meet their needs. The council wants to make the borough a place where high and middle income people choose to live and can afford. The council aims to secure housing suitable for households across the... This is a Labour council, of course, with one of the worst Labour councils, I think, probably in the UK. And it's time we began to not just deal with the Tories, but rip the heads off councils who speak like that. 2 points have been made so far, both by Eileen, that the Tories are still winning. On all these fronts, they're still winning. It hasn't stopped just because we did rather well in the election. And Moyra's also talked about joining up the campaigns. And one simple thing, which a number of people may have seen, and I didn't see until my partner pointed it out to me, but there's been layers of cuts have affected people fighting back in all kinds of ways. And one of the articles about Grenfell has pointed out that the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act 2013 means they're no longer to seek legal aid. So all these campaigns are linked, but we have to choose whatever campaign we can in the local areas, in particular, and national campaigns, to stop this. And obviously now is the time.
It's the first time I made a banner, or we made a banner. So, and Moyra, if you could also maybe, because there is a little addition to Grenfell from us that we put on since we started. So, yeah, 40% rent increase. Right here. From the West Ham and Canning Town residents, solidarity with you. Yeah, we were hit with a 40% rent increase, and that is teachers, nurses, social workers in Newham, and how many teachers were in the Grenfell Tower? Yeah, which I heard. And I heard last week that nurses are now at the food bank collecting food. So it is tough for all of us, but we thought we got together and we got our unions behind us as well. And with our unions, we got an amount of people, because you then get the Socialist Party or the other Socialist Party, as I don't know, and you get the Labour parties, and we were lucky. We had one Labour councillor who specifically for us came out and showed his guts, but it was us together. And we said, no, we won't have a 40% rent increase. It's rude, you're just rude. You can't, it's rude. That's all I can say, you're bloody rude. And we're now finding out how rude they are. But we then decided to, okay, we vote no rent increase. We're going to, fight it until you tell us, or until we can get to agreement, which is in effect a rent strike, but we don't say it as such. Because it is very daunting. And as you know, we work our asses off, and so to mobilize as well, like what you guys already have. We're small, we're starting, but we need to unify, and that is really what it is here. And we actually, media, send it out to the media, milk this cow, because that is why they stopped the rent increase. We got together, not with lawyers, don't pay for them unless they are on your side, and do it pro bono or whatever, because it's the same law that you're dealing with, so it's all the same anyway. And we said together no, and we send them a letter, and we send it to the press. And that's when we got a call, and now for 4 months we haven't had a rent increase, so... We will fight this together, and even how small groups are, just keep at it. Keep at it, and try to not lose your temper like I.
I want to start by saying, actually, I think it's important to be angry. I recently went to the Unison conference, and before we started, one of our assistant general secretaries in K said, don't say too much about Grenfell. 2 of our members died. A lot of our members who work there are traumatised. Don't say too much. And I think we have to be angry, because it's anger that motivates people and makes change happen. And I am going to talk about Nicholas Paget-Brown, because when I saw him on Newsnight, dripping with contempt, and he said, the tenants, we gave them a choice. We said you can have a sprinkler system, but if you do, you'll have to wait for your bathroom and your kitchen to be done. What kind of choice is that? Why can't you have a kitchen, a bathroom and a sprinkler system? Why can't you have a modern home and have it safe? And I'm going to get this off my chest, actually, coming from Tower Hamlets. In Tower Hamlets, we had a Muslim who was forced to stand as an independent to the left of Labour, and he was elected. And they accused him of misspending £47,000 of grants. For that, he was thrown out of office, and 5 commissioners came in to run Tower Hamlets Council. In Tory Kensington Chelsea, you murder 80 people, and all you do is shuffle the cabinet. That tells you all you need to know about class and race and the British establishment. But housing is one of Thatcher's biggest privatisations that people forget about. The right to buy. Stock transfer, including under Blair, the deregulation, the privatisation, and part of their motivation, they hate collective, they hate the idea of housing for need, not profit, but they also think this: council tenants equal Labour voters, home occupiers equal Tory voters. That's what's gone on, except it's broken. Even the Tories now say you can no longer talk about home occupiers as a future because no one can afford it. So there's a moment where we can really shift the debate on housing. And I think the fact that Jeremy Corbyn talked about 1 million homes, 500,000 being council homes, in my opinion, we should have 1 million council homes and more. This is a time to seize back the time on housing. Housing is a vital component of the welfare state that emerged out of the Second World War. Without a decent home, you can't have decent education, you can't have decent health, you can't have any of those things. We need to seize it back. And I'll say this because, to me, housing is one of the strands of protest which will propel Jeremy Corbyn into number 10. It's one of the strong social areas. So I think now we have to agitate on the estates, but we have to make sure that housing is right at the heart of all the social campaigns right now.
Oh yeah, my name's Alistair. I'm a journalist for Socialist Worker. I think the Tory response to Grenfell has shown, both their arrogance and, Hello, is that better? Yeah. All right. Sorry. I think that the Tory response to Grenfell has shown their complete arrogance and their contempt for working class people, but it's also shown just how vulnerable they are. When you're in the area talking to people, I was talking to a local activist, and he said that in Kensington and Chelsea, the idea of social contracts, the idea that people give up, personal freedoms in order for some level of protection from the state at whatever level, is completely dead. It died with the people that died in Grenfell Tower. And I think, the local organisation of ordinary people has really filled the void that has been left by the council. And the anger of survivors has pushed Tory ministers to, throw these local politicians under the bus, to an extent. Nick Paget-Brown, the leader of the council, former leader of the council, Rockfield in Mellon, these people are still councillors. And I think, we have to commend, the work that people like Joe Delaney are doing, on the BBC the other day when he grilled the new housing minister and actually got him to commit to rehousing people locally. Obviously, he needs to be held to account to that, held to account to that and stuff like that. But we need these concrete demands, around housing people locally, amnesty for undocumented migrants who had relatives in the tower and stuff like that. But we also need to keep the pressure on the people at the top, Sajid Javid, Boris Johnson, Gavin Barwell, Theresa May, and also the new Labour politicians that also created the conditions that this happened in, Jim Fitzpatrick, who pushed through the 2005 fire regulations and stuff like that. So I just wanted to talk about how we can do that. So that, the demonstration outside Kensington and Chelsea Town Hall on the 19th of July is going to be incredibly important. The Defend Council House meeting next week on the 12th, is also going to be very important. But also, tenants and residents organisation on the ground. And this is what I wanted to make an appeal about, particularly. If anything is happening on your estate, and we've already seen in Tower Hamlets and other places, people coming together. I was in the area I was in Kensington and Chelsea last week, and there's residents meetings springing up all over the place. So if anything is happening in your area, let Socialist Worker know. Get in touch, find me after the meeting, or send us an email, because I think one of the fundamental things that one of the fundamental things that we learned is the Grenfell Action Group warned about the fire. And they were ignored. And we need tenant organisation and campaigns that are strong enough to not be ignored. Cheers.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about why is the housing crisis happening. Because we're in a really shit situation. We've got high rents trapping people into renting for the rest of their lives. I know I'm one of them, although strangely I'm paying more in rent every month than I would be if I had a mortgage. But I can't use that as proof that I would be able to pay a mortgage, even though I pay it every month so I don't get chucked out on the street anyway. We've got tenant insecurity, so people are ending up having to move house every 6 months or whatever it is because the rents keep getting put up. I know myself, a couple of years ago, I moved house 5 times within 2 years because of the rents kept getting put up. We've got the shit quality of new housing as well. You think of a lot of the housing when you look on, Rightmove places to rent these days, you've got houses that would have been 4 or 5 bedroom houses that have been converted all into 1-bedroom flats without the proper building regulations. They're quite frankly, lots of them with mould and other sorts of structural problems. Also purpose-built blocks of flats. The last block of flats I was living in was purpose-built private housing, and it was all plasterboard. All the walls, you could literally hear when people took a piss upstairs. Excuse my language. Sorry, upstairs. And of course, you get this complete and utter contempt for health and safety regulations because they're deemed too expensive by the people who want to make profit from our housing. And So, it really begs the question, why is this happening? And I think it's really important. One thing I wanted to bring up is that it's really important to say that it is not because of the size of the population or because of migration. There are far more empty homes in the UK than there are homeless people. The right wing love to make out that this housing crisis is caused by migration. They'd like nothing more than for us to blame migrants for the problems that are going on. And what they say is that, we need to build all these millions of homes to keep up with the demand. But actually, they must think we're stupid, because when they talk about the demand, they're conflating the demand of ordinary people like me and you for homes that we actually want to live in with the demand of wealthy multinational investors that want to use housing as gold bricks. Because that's what they're using housing for. Okay, there was a new block of apartments recently, somewhere in South London, I think it was Southwark. It was entirely sold off before it even finished being built, and all of it was to investors who weren't even going to live in the apartments. You hear news stories, don't you, about cleaners who clean these entire blocks of luxury apartments that nobody lives in. And it's happening because housing is one of the most profitable sectors to invest in. Profits are the driving force of capitalism. Capitalism can't exist without profits, but inbuilt within the system is an unescapable tendency for the rate of profit to fall. So what happens is you get capitalists searching out new sectors to make profit in, and they don't care what it is. They don't care if it makes people homeless or suicidal or if it kills them, and they hate social housing because they can't make a profit from it. As far as they're concerned, profit must be made regardless of social costs. And I'm just going to finish really quickly on the fact that there's no way to reconcile this within the system. The housing crisis cannot be solved without the working class coming together to assert democratic control of the system to provide for human need, not profit, and that's a process that we call working class revolution. Thank you.
Right, this will be our last contribution. I'm really, really sorry to the people who didn't get called. There were loads and loads of hands up. I apologise.
Thank you. My name's Glyn Robbins. I'm a member of the Unite Housing Workers Union. I've heard Grenfell described as a Katrina moment. Now, I think that is a comparison that can be exaggerated, but I also don't think it's one that should be entirely discounted. I'll give you 4 very quick reasons why I say that. First of all, if you talk to people in New Orleans or read any of the accounts, it becomes very clear that people were warning that the levees would break for years before it happened. So in the same way that Grenfell was a preventable disaster, so was Hurricane Katrina. You couldn't have stopped the storm, but you could have mitigated the damage that was done, particularly to working class communities in the city. The second thing I think is a valid comparison has been the reactions of politicians to the disasters. I mean, Theresa May arriving at Grenfell, to me, was like Marie Antoinette in Versailles. Let them eat cake. That was her kind of detachment from the experiences of people after Grenfell. Very similar things happened after Katrina. George Bush's Jr.'s mum referred to things working out quite well for people who had been displaced by Katrina because they were poor anyway, she said. So the fact that they're living in a shelter miles away from home and may never go back to home isn't necessarily something that we need to be concerned about. The third thing, and one that I think we have to be particularly vigilant around, and people have alluded to it, is the way that the ruling class will use situations like this as a pretext to accelerate social cleansing and the neoliberal project around housing, but not just housing, other public services as well. And in New Orleans, what they did was effectively use Katrina as an excuse to demolish almost all public housing in the city. They pretended that that was for structural reasons, but as anyone who's been involved in anti-stock transfer campaigns knows, those structural reasons are often false. But nonetheless, that is what happened after Katrina in New Orleans, and we need to be very careful that something similar doesn't happen after Grenfell. And then finally, and I think it's important to be aware of this as well, the sort of cultural and ideological aspects of these kinds of situations. After Katrina, there was an attempt, there is still an attempt to, as it were, reshape New Orleans in a sort of neoliberal middle class and white image. And for example, if anyone's ever seen the situation or the TV show Tremor, you might be aware of the Indian processions through New Orleans, which is a very important cultural tradition, obviously dates back to the original sin of America. And lo and behold, within the last 48 hours, we've had a Tory MP saying that the Notting Hill Carnival should not take place in the place where it belongs. So these are very clear warning signs to us. But I think finally, the most important aspect of what happened in Katrina is that the people of New Orleans, and especially in those worst affected areas, which again were the poorest, the most working class, and where most black people lived, are still suffering. 10 years on, 12 years now, are still suffering, and we all owe it to the victims of Grenfell to make sure that doesn't happen to them. Thanks very much.
I'm going to ask the panel to sum up, but they're going to sum up in reverse order, so we're going to start with Tanya.
Okay, I think that was a really brilliant discussion with some really exciting contributions. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. First of all, Axe the Housing Act kind of is morphing into a much more sort of more wide housing campaign. So we want to keep hold of the coalition that we had, which was so effective, but we want to make it into something that really puts forward a manifesto for housing, which will actually solve the housing crisis rather than what the politicians do, which is talk about it, but then say, okay, well, then we're going to bash planners or we're going to do something that's completely useless. So what Homes for All is calling for, it's a provisional name, it may change, is a massive investment in first-class council housing, 1 million new council homes, as John McLaughlin mentioned earlier, rent control and secure homes for all, stop social cleansing and demolition, scrap the bedroom tax and universal credit, stop scapegoating migrants for the housing crisis. Okay, there's others, but those are the highlights. I just wanted to mention as well, Eileen talked about how fire certificates are can be now sort of produced by the landlord. There's another thing that landlords could do as well that they didn't used to be able to do until quite recently. Landlords and developers can now choose their own building control inspectors. Because building control has been effectively privatised. You do have local authority inspectors, but they are competing on price against private companies. You couldn't really make it up. People talked about, the radical things that need to be done to solve the housing crisis. There's evacuees from Grenfell. There's evacuees from Camden. They may well be allowed back into their homes. There might be cases where they won't be allowed back in. Where are they going to go? Well, why don't we requisition homes? Someone mentioned Southwark. That's quite true. We had a protest outside funnily enough, the developer Lend-Lease. They do crop up. We had a protest outside of their development because, yes, all 100% of the properties in that phase were sold to overseas investors. I walk past this development every day. I can only see about 1 or 2 lights on in the evening. I went past it last night. There's only about 3 flats with lights on. The rest are sitting there waiting to accumulate money for the rich investors. What we've asked in Southwark is that the council makes a list of all the empty properties in the borough and put that list into action should anyone need to be evacuated. Those homes can be turned into council homes. Families right now that are homeless should be put in them. We need a complete change of policy. We need a housing policy that works for working class people. And that includes people both inside and outside the Labour Party fighting for what working class people need. Conrad was right. Ultimately, we need a revolution, but we can have some fun on the way to it.
Okay. The people of North Kensington are in pain, anguish, but we're bloody angry. And I think that anger comes from a long way back. When people talk about social cleansing, I always say that we were the first. It goes back to the mangrove people. If people know about the mangrove, they were trying to cleanse the Caribbean community out of North Kensington for a long, long time. And we've been fighting this campaign relentlessly. We now have a Labour MP, maybe, if we maintain the pressure on her, that she will actually make a change and make some of the demands that we actually want. As for Carnival, they can go on. It is I say to people that this is our wake. We will manage Carnival. We will have Carnival, because the Tories have been trying to move Carnival out of the area for the last, I don't know how many years. And they're not going to do it. And they're certainly not going to do it this year. I also think that actually it's important for me to emphasize, and I can't emphasize it more, I just feel so enraged, the extent to which we hate our local council, and especially the cabinet, not the Labour, because they fought, I think, a losing battle. They're arrogant, they're incompetent, and they have, as everybody has said, complete disdain for the community of North Kensington. And to that end, and I mean, I'm not exaggerating, I walk around my area and we actually go between, as we walk past the pictures and the flowers and look at Grenfell every day, I get people who are either crying or they're raging. They're absolutely filled with anger at the injustice at what happened at Grenfell. And they want that cabinet removed. It is not enough for 3 of them to have resigned. It is not, as far as we're concerned. So therefore, we're saying to everybody, come down to the council meeting on the 19th of July in your hundreds and support North Kensington. We want the whole lot of them to bloody resign. The Justice for Grenfell campaign has it's in its infancy, but we have a few key demands, and people have talked about that. Obviously, that the survivors are housed within the borough. Kensington and Chelsea has 1,400 empty properties. There should be no problem with people being housed within Kensington and Chelsea. And we don't want them housed, although it's going to go ahead, in blocks where people make comments like, oh, well, we've paid the service charges, and these people are not going to be allowed to use the swimming pool and the spa. We want people not to, having gone through Grenfell, to now be housed in a hostile community. So we want decent housing for all the survivors and the evacuees. We also want an amnesty, as we've said again and again, for the undocumented survivors and those people who are in the middle of their asylum claims. We want an amnesty that extends beyond the 1 year that actually Theresa May or whoever has offered. We want to have some control over the remit of the inquiry. And at the moment, there is no trust within the community for the so-called social cleansing Morbic who's been appointed. So we want to be able to have a say as to who leads that inquiry, and we want actually some control of what that inquiry consists of, because it must include not just the cladding and the lack of safety, but it has to actually include what's happened before and after. So I encourage everybody to please support Justice for Grenfell. It is a tough campaign. You know, the impact on the community is wide-ranging. There's still the issue when we talk about health and safety, and this is my personal concern because I live 300 meters from Grenfell. We worry about the tower falling down. Honestly, it's not me being paranoid. They had a fire drill 2 days ago because the building started moving. We worried about the fact that all the flats had asbestos in them, And so the fire has actually sprinkled the asbestos. We worry about the fact that the cladding had cyanide in it. You know, there are some key health and safety questions that still has not been answered. So those are the things that we're also worrying about, as well as, and I think for me as a teacher, I think this is really important, and as a human being, there's enormous trauma in our community. And with everything else, trying to house people, feed them, deal with all their needs, there's still very uncoordinated, the level of trauma and grief support. And that's going to be needed in the future and for quite a while. So I would say to everybody, support the Justice for Grenfell campaign and come down on the 19th. Thank you.
I think it's the job of all of us to be Justice for Grenfell. People who are dead can't do that job. People who are traumatised and left with nothing are actually impressively trying to do that job. But we have to be Justice for Grenfell. We have to stand beside them. And it's not a them and us question. It's not a you don't come from North Ken. If we don't organise to ensure that the two things that they said right from the beginning, that everybody is rehoused with a secure tenancy, whatever their tenancy was before, everybody is rehoused in their own community with a secure tenancy, and that everybody responsible is held to account. That is our job, to make sure those things happen. There's no standing back here, but this has to, so therefore we all have to be calling on your union or your council or your landlord to publicly call for these things, to get in there and support them. But we have to, there's another element of it. I think because the Grenfell campaign has already put back on the agenda in the most practical and real way, taking over empty luxury housing to meet people's needs. It's on the agenda, but how do we make it actually happen? Glyn was talking about New Orleans, but in this book, what he wrote, there's some other examples that I think we need to learn from. The tent cities, where people go and camp out round a place and say, we are not going until you put us in there. Now, I think that to move this along, we're going to have to do that. Along with the rent strikes and the occupations, we are going to have to say, see that block in North Ken or wherever it is, we're not going until you put these families in it. Now, I can pipe dream, but I can't organise that by myself, but we collectively, we can do that. And this is the time when we have to be stepping up to that. I want to say another thing, though, that we mentioned it but not really named it, the way that an element of what Kensington and Chelsea Council didn't like about Grenfell and don't like about North Ken, and an element about what Theresa May can't handle either, is their racism. They're imbued with a sense that these are the other. These are not our people. These are, how did these people get to be here? You can almost see it emanating from them. And I think you can also see the opposite, that for the working class of London, it was the opposite thing. It might have been Ramadan, but people, young Muslim organisations just dropped everything and responded. Working class people whose kids might only have 2 pairs of trainers brought one of them down to put it where it was needed. That's the way we respond in solidarity and in need. And we need to not let that stop when the most immediate thing we can all understand about food and clothing and shelter, when that immediate thing isn't the need on us, but when solidarity action and organising and responding to what the campaign calls on us to do, we have to be organised to do that because, you know, as atomised individuals, how do we achieve that? The danger is that after the peak moment, when the weakness and the patheticness of the state is exposed and crumbles and working class people respond, or people respond collectively and individually, after that moment passes, we go back to, well, there's housing experts and there's fire safety experts and there's the people who run the government. That, what Grenfell says is that business as usual means we burn in our beds. And business as usual won't do, but that is the challenge. This is the moment when we have to make that more than a slogan. Homes for People, Not for Profit has to be turned into something real through the rent strikes, the resistance, the tent cities, the occupations. And we can't do that unless we organise collectively. I know no other way. And on that point, I think the struggle of tenants and the struggle of would-be tenants and the struggle of people who are paying more mortgage than you can ever see the end of, this is part of a class struggle. This is as much as a trade union struggle and absolutely sits alongside it. And we are entitled to go to your trades council and your union general secretary and whatever and say, get down here beside us, get down there beside Grenfell. This is part of our fight for justice. So one other point I want to make is about councils, because this has been controversial and difficult, and, you know, it can be. We just found out in the last 2 days that Tower Hamlets Council, supposedly having learnt some lessons when we fought them over stock transfer, are now talking about demolishing an estate in Whitechapel. Why would they be doing that, I wonder, when gentrification tides are kind of pouring through the area? We have to beat them. And at the same time, these same people, we have to work with them on other issues. But what I think if you're in or around the Labour Party or any other, you know, elected politicians, this is the time when we have to be clear with them, with all our representatives. There is only one way to build a housing movement that will push back against a market that absolutely doesn't work. There's only one way to build that movement, and that is with the people power, with the tenants and residents and the people who are struggling for housing in a movement together. Councils, if they think they're being clever and trying to play the market, Cambridge Council, for example, we know has played a really progressive role in some ways, was part of the Axe the Housing Act movement from the beginning, came to some of the demonstrations. They've got some money to build housing, and they're saying, oh, well, there's a bit of a problem here, so 40% of it will have to be for private rent or sale. This isn't if you do that, if you go down that road, if you fudge it, then you're going to make enemies of the tenants and the people on the waiting list and the rest of us who are fighting for housing justice. This is not the moment to make enemies of us. This is the moment to stand with us, because we have, Jeremy Corbyn said, things can be different. That's, in my opinion, why everybody got behind him, because at last somebody stood up and said, it can be different and we're going to do it. It can't be different if Tower Hamlets Council goes around demolishing estates where council tenants live and then comes to us and says, vote Labour. That is not a way that you build a housing movement of resistance. So this is the time to stop the business as usual and to get behind the wide movement to achieve housing justice, to achieve rent control, not just rent caps, to build the housing that we need that is secure and really affordable. And all this starts with justice for Grenfell.